I'm Emma, and I'm 27 years old. You don't belong in this family, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the birthday party chatter like a knife. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I stood frozen by the dessert table, a slice of cake halfway to my mouth. I set the plate down slowly, my hand steady despite the heat crawling up my neck. Without a word, I walked to the coat closet, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. But what happened 3 months later would leave Victoria packing her bags instead of me. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Now, let me take you back to how this all started. The Thompson family barbecue was supposed to be a celebration of Tyler's 8th birthday. My little half-brother had been talking about this party for weeks, excited about the bounce house Dad had rented and the superhero decorations Victoria had ordered. I'd spent the morning helping set up, arranging tables and hanging streamers, while Victoria directed operations from her lawn chair, claiming her back was acting up again. The guests were mostly Victoria's friends from her yoga class and their children, plus a few neighbors. As Tyler's older sister, I'd brought him his favorite gift, a remote-controlled car we'd been eyeing together at the toy store. His face lit up when he unwrapped it, and for a moment, I felt like I actually belonged at this party. That feeling didn't last long. Victoria had been making subtle digs all afternoon, loud enough for others to hear but delivered with a smile that made them sound almost affectionate. Emma's always been independent, she told Mrs. Patterson from next door when I declined her offer to set me up with her nephew. She prefers keeping to herself rather than family activities. The comment stung because it wasn't true. I'd tried for 8 years to find my place in this reconstituted family, but Victoria had a talent for making me feel like an intruder in my childhood home. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. Every family photo somehow managed to crop me out. Every holiday gathering left me feeling more like hired help than a daughter. But this time was different. This time, she'd said it loud enough for everyone to hear, bold enough to make it clear she meant every word. As I drove away from the house where I'd grown up, where my mother's pictures still hung in my father's bedroom, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't running away anymore. I was planning my return. The next morning, I sat in my downtown apartment, staring at my phone. Dad had called 3 times, texted twice, and even sent an email with the subject line, "We need to talk." Victoria's name hadn't appeared on my screen once, which told me everything I needed to know about her feelings regarding yesterday's incident. My relationship with Victoria had always been complicated, but it hadn't started out hostile. When Dad first brought her home 8 years ago, I'd actually been relieved. He'd been so lost after Mom died, and Victoria seemed to bring light back into his eyes. She was young, energetic, and treated me like a friend rather than a burden. That changed when she got pregnant with Tyler. Suddenly, I wasn't the daughter helping Dad heal. I was the reminder of his first marriage, the obstacle to their perfect new family. The shift was subtle at first. Victoria would forget to mention family plans until the last minute, leaving me scrambling to rearrange my schedule. She'd make dinner reservations for 4 when there were 5 people in the house, claiming she'd miscounted. Then Madison came along 2 years later, and my status in the family became even more precarious. Victoria transformed from subtle to strategic, always having a reason why I couldn't join family activities. I was too busy with college, then too busy with work. I was probably tired from my schedule, wouldn't want to be bothered with kid activities. Dad seemed oblivious to the dynamic, or maybe he chose not to see it. Robert Thompson had built his success in commercial real estate by avoiding conflict and finding win-win solutions. Family drama fell outside his comfort zone, so he defaulted to letting Victoria handle household management while he focused on providing for everyone. The irony was that I genuinely loved Tyler and Madison. They were sweet kids who had no idea their mother was actively working to distance them from their big sister. Tyler especially had always gravitated toward me, asking for help with homework and wanting to show me his latest drawings. But Victoria had been subtly discouraging these connections, redirecting the kids' attention whenever they sought me out. My phone buzzed with another text from Dad. "Victoria says there was a misunderstanding yesterday. Can we all sit down and work this out?" A misunderstanding. That's what we were calling it now. I almost laughed, but there wasn't anything funny about being publicly declared a non-family member at a child's birthday party. Victoria hadn't accidentally spoken her truth. She'd planned it, waiting for the perfect moment when the humiliation would be witnessed, and therefore impossible to take back. I typed back, "Sure, Dad, but this conversation needs to include everyone's feelings, not just Victoria's explanation." As I hit send, I realized something had changed in me. For 8 years, I'd been trying to earn my place in a family where I'd always belonged. Maybe it was time to stop asking for permission to exist in my own life. The family meeting was scheduled for Sunday dinner, which should have been my first warning. Victoria always used social settings to her advantage, banking on the fact that I wouldn't make a scene in front of the kids. She'd prepared Tyler's favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs, and set the table with our good china, creating an atmosphere that screamed special occasion rather than conflict resolution. Tyler and Madison chattered excitedly about their week while Victoria served generous portions, and Dad asked about everyone's plans for the upcoming school year. The performance was flawless. Loving stepmother, devoted father, happy family. I might as well have been invisible for all the attention anyone paid to why we were really gathered. It wasn't until after dessert, when the kids had been excused to watch a movie in the living room, that Victoria finally addressed the elephant in the room. She reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for terminal patients. "Emma, sweetheart," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "I think we had a little miscommunication at Tyler's party. Sometimes when I'm overwhelmed with hosting duties, I don't express myself clearly." I looked at Dad, waiting for him to acknowledge what had actually happened, but he was nodding along with Victoria's revision of events. The disappointment hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't been there when she'd made her declaration, but other people had told him exactly what was said. He was choosing Victoria's version because it was easier. "What exactly did you mean to say?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was trying to suggest that you might be more comfortable socializing with people your own age instead of standing around a children's party. You seemed so out of place, honey. I was actually trying to be considerate of your feelings." The gaslighting was masterful. She'd taken a moment of public humiliation and reframed it as motherly concern, making me sound ungrateful for questioning her motives. Dad was buying every word, relief evident on his face that this could all be chalked up to a simple misunderstanding. 20 people heard you say I don't belong in this family," I said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson asked me if I was adopted because she was confused about my status here." "People mishear things," Victoria replied smoothly, then turned to Dad with wounded eyes. "Robert, you know I would never deliberately hurt Emma. She's been part of our family since the beginning." Since the beginning. Not she is family, or she's my stepdaughter. Since the beginning, implying a starting point that could also have an ending point. Even her apology contained subtle poison. Dad reached for my hand. "Emma, honey, I think we're all making too big a deal out of this. Victoria didn't mean anything by it, and you know she cares about you." In that moment, I realized the conversation was pointless. Dad would always choose the path of least resistance, and Victoria would always find ways to chip away at my belonging here. But something else was becoming clear. I didn't need their permission to know who I was or where I came from. "You're right, Dad," I said, standing up from the table. "This probably is being blown out of proportion." Victoria's smile returned, triumphant and satisfied. She thought she'd won. What she didn't realize was that I just stopped playing her game entirely. Sometimes the best revenge is refusing to be broken by people who expect you to shatter. The next few weeks passed in an uneasy detente. Victoria had gotten her way. I'd backed down from the confrontation, accepted her non-apology, and allowed the family narrative to return to its comfortable fiction. But I'd also started paying closer attention to things I'd previously ignored, and what I was seeing troubled me more than I'd expected. Tyler had developed a stutter that seemed to worsen whenever Victoria was around. Madison, who used to be chatty and affectionate, had become clingy and anxious, often asking me if I was mad at her for reasons I couldn't understand. The kids were picking up on tensions they were too young to comprehend, and it was affecting their behavior in ways that broke my heart. I decided to spend more one-on-one time with them, partly because I genuinely missed my little siblings, and partly because I wanted to understand what they were experiencing. I started picking Tyler up from soccer practice when Dad was traveling for work, which was happening more frequently these days. His real estate company was expanding into new markets, leaving Victoria essentially in charge of household management and childcare. During our car rides, Tyler gradually opened up about things that worried me. He mentioned that Mom, meaning Victoria, got really angry sometimes when Dad wasn't around. He described episodes of yelling that seemed disproportionate to typical childhood misbehavior. When I gently probed for specifics, he claimed up, clearly having been coached about what family information was appropriate to share. Madison was even more revealing in her innocence. During a coloring session while Victoria ran errands, she casually mentioned that Mommy talks to Uncle Jake a lot when Daddy's not home. Uncle Jake was Victoria's brother who lived across town, but something about Madison's tone suggested these weren't typical sibling check-ins. "Do you like Uncle Jake?" I asked, keeping my voice casual while we worked on her princess coloring book. He's nice, Madison replied, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. But Mommy says it's a secret when he visits. She says Daddy doesn't like grown-up conversations. The comment sent warning bells through my mind. What kind of grown-up conversations required secrecy? And why would Victoria need to hide her brother's visits from Dad? I tried to push the concerns aside, telling myself I was looking for problems because of my existing issues with Victoria. But then I started noticing other things. Victoria's phone was constantly buzzing with messages she'd read quickly and delete. She'd developed a habit of stepping outside to take certain calls, claiming she needed privacy for book club planning or yoga class coordination. Her explanations always sounded reasonable, but the frequency and secretiveness seemed excessive. The biggest red flag came during Tyler's soccer game the following Saturday. Dad had to work, so Victoria and I took the kids together, a rare occurrence that felt awkward from the start. While Tyler played, Madison entertained herself on the playground equipment near the field. Halfway through the game, Victoria's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and her entire demeanor changed. Her face flushed. She smiled in a way I'd never seen before, and she walked several yards away to answer. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see her body language. Animated, flirtatious, completely absorbed in whoever was on the other end of the line. When she returned, she seemed flustered and distracted. "That was my sister," she said without being asked. "Family drama, you know how it is." But Victoria didn't have a sister. She had two brothers, Jake and Michael. I knew this because I'd been to family gatherings for 8 years and had specifically asked about Victoria's family structure when she first joined ours. The lie was so casual and unnecessary that it made me wonder what else she'd been dishonest about. For the first time since the birthday party incident, I began to suspect that my problems with Victoria might be symptoms of much larger issues in our family. The discovery happened by accident 3 weeks later. I'd stopped by the house to pick up some tax documents Dad needed me to review for his business when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Victoria was supposed to be at her Wednesday yoga class, and the kids were still at school, so I was surprised to find anyone home. I paused in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like an intimate conversation. Victoria's voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, almost vulnerable. "I know this is complicated," she was saying, "but things with Robert are getting worse. He's never home, and when he is, we barely talk anymore." A man's voice responded, too low for me to make out the words, but the tone was warm and reassuring. I crept closer, my curiosity overriding my better judgment about eavesdropping. "The kids ask about you constantly," Victoria continued. "Tyler drew you another picture yesterday, and Madison keeps asking when you're coming to visit again. I hate having to make excuses." My stomach dropped. Victoria had been bringing someone around the children, someone they'd developed an attachment to while maintaining secrecy from Dad. This wasn't about her brother Jake or innocent family visits. This was something else entirely. I backed away carefully, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to confront the situation immediately, but I realized I needed more information before making accusations that could destroy our family. If Victoria was having an affair, Dad deserved to know. But I needed proof, not just overheard conversation fragments. Over the next 2 weeks, I became an unwitting detective in my own family's drama. I started paying attention to Victoria's patterns, noting when she claimed to have plans that seemed inconsistent with her actual whereabouts. I tracked her social media posts, looking for clues about her activities and companions. The evidence accumulated gradually. Photos tagged at restaurants during times she'd claimed to beat book club meetings, check-ins at locations across town when she was supposedly running errands nearby. Most damning was a picture posted by one of her yoga classmates showing the group at their Wednesday session, without Victoria, on a day she'd specifically told Dad she was attending. But it was Tyler who provided the most heartbreaking revelation. During another soccer practice pickup, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Emma," he said as we drove home, "why does Mommy say you don't live with us anymore?" I nearly swerved into the next lane. "What do you mean, buddy?" "She told Uncle Jake that you moved out because you didn't want to be part of our family, but you still come over all the time, so I don't understand." Victoria had been telling people, including this mysterious Uncle Jake, that I'd voluntarily distanced myself from the family. She was rewriting the narrative of our relationship, painting herself as the victim of my rejection, rather than the architect of my exclusion. "Tyler," I said carefully, "I've never said I don't want to be part of our family. I love you and Madison very much, and this will always be my home too." "Really?" His relief was palpable. "Mommy said you were probably going to move far away because you were unhappy here." That night, I called Dad and asked if we could have lunch the next day, just the two of us. It was time for him to know what was really happening in his house while he was busy building his business empire. Victoria had been counting on his absence and his conflict-avoidant nature to keep her secrets safe. She'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how much his children meant to him and how far I'd go to protect them. Dad looked tired when we met at his favorite downtown steakhouse the next afternoon. The stress lines around his eyes seemed deeper than I remembered, and he'd lost weight since I'd last really looked at him. Building his real estate empire was taking a physical toll that concerned me more than our family drama. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said after we'd ordered. "Is everything okay?" I'd rehearsed this conversation, but actually starting it felt overwhelming. How do you tell your father that his wife might be cheating on him? How do you explain that his children are being exposed to situations they don't understand? How do you reveal that you've been investigating your own family like a detective? "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really hear me," I began. "How much do you know about what happens at home when you're traveling for work?" His expression shifted from casual interest to concern. "What do you mean?" "Victoria manages everything beautifully. The kids are happy, the house runs smoothly. She's been incredible about handling the domestic side while I focus on expanding the business." "When did you last have a real conversation with Tyler and Madison about their day-to-day experiences?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "We talk all the time, dinner conversations, bedtime stories when I'm home. They tell me about school, their friends, activities." "Dad, Tyler has developed a stutter that gets worse when Victoria is around. Madison asks me constantly if I'm angry with her, like she's walking on eggshells. And they both mention Uncle Jake visiting frequently when you're not home." Dad frowned. "Jake is Victoria's brother. Of course he visits sometimes. What's wrong with that?" "Victoria told the kids that these visits are supposed to be secret from you. She's also been lying about her whereabouts consistently, claiming to be places where she hasn't actually been, posting photos that contradict her stated schedules." I watched Dad's face carefully as I laid out the evidence. His initial reaction was defensive, the natural response of a man whose marriage and judgment were being questioned. But as I continued, describing specific incidents and inconsistencies, his expression grew troubled. "Emma," he said finally, "I understand you've been having difficulties with Victoria since Tyler's party, but these sound like serious accusations. Are you sure you're not reading more into normal situations because of your feelings about what happened?" The question hurt, but I'd expected it. Dad's entire personality was built around avoiding conflict and finding logical explanations for problems. Accepting that his wife might be deceiving him would require facing the possibility that his second chance at happiness was falling apart. "Dad, 3 weeks ago, I overheard Victoria on the phone with someone discussing how your marriage is deteriorating and how the kids have developed an attachment to this person. This wasn't a casual conversation with her brother about family issues. This was intimate, secretive, and involved our family's private business being shared with someone outside our household." Dad was quiet for a long moment, absently moving food around his plate. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a vulnerability I hadn't seen since Mom died. "I've been so focused on building financial security for all of us," he said quietly. "The expansion has been demanding, but I thought I was doing the right thing for our family's future. Victoria always seems to have everything under control at home. Maybe it's time to step back from work expansion and focus on what's happening with your family right now," I suggested gently. Dad nodded slowly. "I'm supposed to leave for a conference in Atlanta tomorrow, but maybe I should postpone that trip." As we walked to our cars after lunch, Dad suddenly stopped and turned to me. "Emma, regardless of what's happening with Victoria, I want you to know that you'll always be my daughter and part of this family. If I've ever made you feel otherwise, I'm truly sorry." The apology I'd been waiting 8 years to hear shouldn't have come in a restaurant parking lot while discussing my stepmother's potential infidelity, but I'd take it. Something told me we were all going to need each other very soon. Dad did cancel his Atlanta trip, claiming a family emergency to his business partners. Victoria seemed surprised but pleased when he announced he'd be working from home for the next 2 weeks. "More family time," she said brightly, though I caught a flicker of concern in her eyes. Having Dad around would definitely complicate her secret phone calls and mysterious errands. What none of us expected was the real emergency that would change everything. On Thursday morning, Dad collapsed while getting dressed for a local client meeting. Victoria called and I met them at the hospital, my hands shaking as I drove through downtown traffic that seemed deliberately slow. Dr. Martinez, the emergency room physician, was thorough but gentle as he explained Dad's condition. "Mr. Thompson has been experiencing cardiac episodes that likely started months ago," she told us as we gathered in the small consultation room. "The symptoms probably felt like indigestion or stress-related chest tightness." Dad looked pale and smaller than usual in the hospital bed, wearing a gown that made him seem vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. "I thought it was just work stress," he admitted. "The expansion has been demanding, lots of late nights and pressure." "Robert, why didn't you tell me you were having chest pains?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the perfect tone of concerned wife. But I noticed she hadn't moved closer to his bedside, hadn't reached for his hand the way you'd expect from someone genuinely worried about their spouse. "Doctor." Martinez continued with test results that grew increasingly serious. Dad's heart had sustained significant damage, likely from multiple small episodes over several months. The immediate crisis was stabilized, but long-term solutions would require major intervention. "We're looking at surgical options," Dr. Martinez explained, "but given the extent of damage, Mr. Thompson may need to consider heart transplant evaluation if other treatments aren't successful." The word transplant hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria made appropriate shocked noises, but something about her reaction felt performative. I wondered if she'd noticed Dad's symptoms and chosen to ignore them, too caught up in her own drama to pay attention to her husband's health. Over the next few days, Dad underwent extensive testing while we maintained a bedside vigil that felt surreal. Victoria brought the kids for brief visits, coaching them to be quiet and gentle with Daddy. Tyler drew pictures of superheroes helping people feel better, while Madison sat close to me, asking whispered questions about whether Dad was going to die. It was during one of these hospital sessions that I noticed Victoria stepping out frequently to take phone calls. Her excuse was updating family members and coordinating with Dad's business partners. But I recognized the pattern from my recent observations. These weren't crisis management calls. They were the same secretive conversation she'd been having for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's health emergency had created the perfect cover for Victoria's continued deception. She could claim any unusual behavior or unexplained absences were related to stress over his condition, but watching her prioritize phone calls over her husband's medical crisis only reinforced my growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with her commitment to our family. On Sunday evening, Dr. Martinez delivered news that would change everything. Dad's condition had stabilized enough for him to go home, but he would need ongoing monitoring and lifestyle changes. More importantly, they wanted to begin testing family members as potential organ donors, just in case the surgical interventions weren't sufficient. "We'll start with immediate family," Dr. Martinez explained. "Children, siblings, parents if they're living. The matching process is complex, but having multiple potential donors increases the chances of finding compatibility." Victoria nodded seriously. "Of course, whatever Robert needs. The children and I will do whatever testing is required." As we prepared to leave the hospital, I felt a strange mixture of relief about Dad's immediate recovery and apprehension about what the donor testing might reveal. Something told me we were about to learn things about our family that would make my suspicions about Victoria seem minor by comparison. The donor testing began the following Tuesday at the hospital's transplant center. Dad was scheduled for additional cardiac evaluations, while Victoria, Tyler, Madison, and I underwent blood work and preliminary screening to determine our compatibility as potential organ donors. Tyler was nervous about the blood draw, so I held his hand while the technician worked quickly and efficiently. "It doesn't hurt that much," I told him, though he squeezed my fingers tightly when the needle went in. Madison watched her brother's procedure with wide eyes, then bravely extended her arm when her turn came. Victoria seemed unusually quiet during the process, answering the medical questionnaire with unusual hesitation. When asked about family medical history, she claimed not to remember specific details about genetic conditions or inherited diseases. For someone who'd been married to Dad for 8 years, her knowledge of relevant health information seemed surprisingly limited. "The initial results should be available by Friday," the genetic counselor explained as we finished up. "We'll call everyone individually to discuss compatibility and next steps if needed." The waiting period was tense for all of us. Dad was home recovering, working reduced hours while following strict dietary and activity restrictions. Victoria maintained her devoted wife performance, preparing heart-healthy meals and monitoring his medications. But I noticed she still found excuses to leave the house for errands that seemed unnecessarily frequent. Friday morning arrived with a phone call that would shatter our family's foundation. Dr. Martinez asked Dad and Victoria to come in together to discuss the test results, which seemed unusual but not alarming. They were supposed to call me afterward with an update on everyone's compatibility status. Instead, Dad called 3 hours later with a voice I'd never heard before. Hollow, broken, confused. "Emma," he said slowly, "I need you to come to the hospital. There's something we need to discuss about the test results." I found them in Dr. Martinez's office, Victoria sitting stiffly in her chair, while Dad stared out the window with a blank expression. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable as she explained the situation. The genetic testing revealed some unexpected information about family relationships, she began carefully. While we were evaluating compatibility for potential organ donation, we discovered that Tyler and Madison are not biologically related to Mr. Thompson. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had already exploded. Victoria was staring at her hands, her face pale and expressionless. Dad continued looking out the window as if the conversation were happening to someone else. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though my mind was already processing the implications. It means that Robert is not the biological father of Tyler and Madison, Dr. Martinez said gently. The genetic markers are definitive. There's no possibility of laboratory error. I looked at Victoria, waiting for her to say something, to explain how this could have happened, to show some reaction to news that was devastating her husband. But she just sat there, silent and still, like someone who'd been caught in a lie she'd never expected to be discovered. Victoria, Dad said quietly, finally turning from the window, is there something you need to tell me? The question was calm, almost conversational, but I could hear years of marriage collapsing in those 8 words. Victoria looked up at him with tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of remorse, fear, or just sadness at being caught. Robert, I can explain, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction that explanation would make any difference. Dad nodded slowly. I think you'd better. What do you think will happen next? This family is about to face the biggest test of their lives, and the truth Victoria has been hiding is going to change everything. Victoria's explanation came in fragments, each revelation worse than the last. We'd moved to a private consultation room where she could speak freely without medical staff overhearing family business that would soon become a legal matter. Robert, I never meant for any of this to happen, she began, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. When we first got married, I was so young and overwhelmed. You were grieving Emma's mother, working constantly, and I felt so alone. Dad's expression remained neutral, but I could see him processing each word carefully. 8 years of marriage were being dissected in real time, every memory now suspect. The affair started about a year after we got married, Victoria continued. Jake introduced me to his friend Marcus at a barbecue. We started talking, and it just happened. I was lonely, and Marcus paid attention to me in ways that made me feel special. Jake, the brother whose visits were supposed to be secret from Dad. The family drama I'd overheard on the phone suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't about sibling support. Jake had been facilitating his sister's affair for years. Tyler and Madison? Dad said quietly, his voice barely audible. How long have you known? I suspected early on, Victoria admitted, unable to meet his eyes. Tyler looks so much like Marcus, and Madison has his mannerisms. But I convinced myself that maybe genetics could skip generations, that maybe they could still be yours. The clinical detachment in Dad's voice was heartbreaking. But you knew there was a strong possibility they weren't mine, and you let me raise them as my children for 8 years. You loved them, Victoria said desperately. You've been such a wonderful father to them. That has to count for something, right? Biology doesn't change the relationship you've built with them. I watched Dad struggle with emotions that seemed too large for any person to contain. These children he'd loved, protected, and planned his future around weren't his biological offspring. The woman he'd trusted with rebuilding his life after devastating loss had been living an elaborate lie for their entire marriage. Where is Marcus now? I asked, needing to understand the full scope of Victoria's deception. Victoria's face crumpled further. He lives in Phoenix. He's married with children of his own. He doesn't know about Tyler and Madison. I never told him I was pregnant when I ended things with him. You ended things? Dad's question carried a note of surprise. When I found out I was pregnant with Tyler, I realized I had to choose. I chose you, Robert. I chose our marriage and our family. I've been faithful ever since Tyler was born. The statement hung in the air, and I could see Dad calculating the timeline in his head. Faithful for 7 years after a betrayal that had produced 2 children. Was that redemption, or just damage control? The phone calls, I said, pieces clicking into place. The secret conversations I've been overhearing. That's been about this situation, hasn't it? Victoria nodded miserably. Jake has been pressuring me to tell you the truth, especially after you got sick. He said it wasn't fair to keep lying when you might need medical treatment that could be affected by family history. And Marcus has been calling because Tyler looks so much like him that people in Phoenix have started commenting. Dad stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to both of us. When he spoke, his voice was steady but distant. Victoria, I need you to pack some things and stay with your brother for a while. I need time to think about all of this without you in the house. Robert, please, Victoria begged. We can work through this. I know I should have told you years ago, but I was scared of losing you and the children. Everything I did was because I love this family. Dad turned around, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Complete emotional shutdown. You were scared of losing us? He repeated. Victoria, you've built our entire marriage on a lie. Tyler and Madison call me daddy, but I have no legal rights to them. You've let me plan for their college education, their future, their inheritance, knowing that their real father is living in another state, completely unaware of their existence. The legal implications were staggering. Dad had no parental rights to children he'd raised since birth. Victoria could take them and leave anytime she wanted, and he'd have no legal recourse. The children he'd loved unconditionally were not actually his to protect. Pack your things, Victoria, Dad repeated quietly. I'll stay with the kids tonight and explain what they need to know in an age-appropriate way, but you need to leave so I can figure out what comes next. As Victoria gathered her purse to leave, she turned to me with desperation in her eyes. Emma, you understand complicated family situations. Can't you help me explain to your father that families aren't just about biology? The audacity was breathtaking. After 8 years of making me feel like I didn't belong in this family, she was now asking me to advocate for her right to stay in it. The irony was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was remotely amusing. I think you need to focus on what's best for Tyler and Madison right now, I said carefully. They're going to need stability and truth, not more confusion. Victoria nodded and left the consultation room, leaving Dad and me to process the wreckage of everything we'd thought we knew about our family. The drive home from the hospital was silent. Both Dad and I lost in thoughts too complex for conversation. Tyler and Madison were at Victoria's friend Sarah's house for a playdate that would now need to be extended while we figured out how to handle the most difficult conversation of their young lives. Dad went straight to his bedroom when we got home, closing the door behind him. I sat in the living room surrounded by family photos that now felt like evidence of an elaborate fraud. Pictures of Tyler's first steps, Madison's kindergarten graduation, family vacations where Victoria smiled at the camera while harboring secrets that would destroy everything. An hour later, Dad emerged looking older than I'd ever seen him. He'd changed into jeans and an old sweater, abandoning the business attire that usually defined him. Emma, he said, sitting heavily on the couch beside me, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. I nodded, preparing myself for whatever was coming. How long have you suspected that something was wrong with Victoria? The question was direct and painful. Dad, I've been concerned about her behavior for weeks, but I never imagined anything like this. I thought she might be having an affair, but I had no idea about Tyler and Madison's parentage. The affair you suspected, he said quietly. Tell me what you observed. I walked him through everything. The secretive phone calls, the lies about her whereabouts, the conversations with Uncle Jake that the children were told to keep secret, the intimate phone conversation I'd overheard weeks earlier. Dad listened without interruption, his face growing more pained with each detail. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked when I finished. I was going to, I said honestly. But then you got sick, and it felt wrong to add more stress to an already terrible situation. I never imagined the medical testing would reveal what it did. Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at the family photos scattered across our coffee table. 8 years, he finally said. 8 years of loving children who were never legally mine. 8 years of planning a future based on complete deception. Dad, I said carefully, the love you have for Tyler and Madison is real, regardless of biology. You've been their father in every way that matters. But I have no legal rights to them, he replied bitterly. Victoria could disappear with them tomorrow, and I'd have no recourse. She could move to Phoenix with their real father, and I'd never see them again. The legal reality was as devastating as the emotional betrayal. Dad had been an active, loving parent to these children, but in the eyes of the law, he was a stranger with no claim to their welfare or custody. There might be options, I suggested. Adoptive rights, psychological bonds, the fact that you've been their primary father figure. We should talk to a lawyer about what kind of protections might be available. Dad's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and sighed. Victoria wants to know when she can talk to the children. She says they're asking why Mommy won't be home for dinner. The immediate crisis of explaining this situation to Tyler and Madison suddenly felt overwhelming. How do you tell an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old that their entire family structure has been built on lies? How do you preserve their sense of security while acknowledging that everything they've believed about their identity is false? What are you going to tell them? I asked. I don't know, Dad admitted. The truth eventually, but in pieces they can understand. Tonight, I'll probably just say that Mommy and Daddy need some time to work out grown-up problems, and she's staying with Uncle Jake for a while. Do you want me to be here when you talk to them? Dad looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. Would you? I know this isn't your responsibility, but Tyler and Madison trust you. Having you here might help them feel more secure. For 8 years, Victoria had worked to make me feel like an outsider in this family. Now, in the aftermath of her deception, Dad was asking me to help hold what remained of our family together. The irony was bitter, but my love for Tyler and Madison was genuine, regardless of the complicated circumstances that had brought us to this moment. Of course I'll be here, I said. Whatever you need. As we waited for Sarah to bring the children home, I realized that Victoria's lies had inadvertently revealed something true. Families aren't just about biology, but they are about honesty, commitment, and choosing to show up for each other when everything falls apart. Dad and I were about to find out if what we had left was strong enough to survive the complete destruction of everything we'd believed about ourselves. Tyler and Madison walked into the house chattering about their playdate, completely unaware that their world had fundamentally changed while they were gone. Tyler was excited about the new video game he'd played, while Madison carried a drawing she'd made for Daddy's room at the hospital. Dad gathered them on the living room couch, his voice gentle but serious. Kids, I need to talk to you about some grown-up things that are happening in our family. Both children immediately became quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Tyler moved closer to Dad, while Madison climbed into my lap without being asked. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about how families work, Dad began carefully. Mommy and I are having some problems that we need to figure out, so she's going to stay with Uncle Jake for a while. Is Mommy in trouble? Madison asked, her voice small and worried. No, sweetheart, Mommy isn't in trouble. But sometimes when grown-ups disagree about important things, they need space to think clearly about what's best for everyone. Tyler, who was more perceptive than his age suggested, asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you and Mommy getting divorced like Jacob's parents did? Dad's hesitation was brief but telling. I don't know yet, buddy. That's one of the things we need to figure out. But no matter what happens between Mommy and me, you and Madison will always be loved and taken care of. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dad answering their questions as honestly as possible without overwhelming them with details they weren't ready to understand. He promised that Victoria would call them before bedtime and that they'd see her soon, but he was careful not to make commitments about the future that he couldn't guarantee. After the children went to bed, Dad and I sat in the kitchen trying to process the day's revelations and plan for an uncertain future. The house felt different somehow, smaller and quieter, like a stage set after the performance had ended. I keep thinking about all the moments that make sense now, Dad said, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Victoria's reluctance to add the children to my life insurance policy, her insistence on keeping separate bank accounts, the way she'd changed the subject whenever I talked about updating our wills. Each memory was another piece of evidence that Victoria had been protecting herself and maintaining exit strategies throughout their marriage. She'd never fully committed to the life they'd built together because she'd always known it was built on deception. There's something else, Dad said quietly. When Dr. Martinez was explaining the test results, she mentioned that Tyler has some genetic markers that indicate a predisposition to certain health conditions. Conditions that Marcus would need to know about as Tyler's biological father. The implications were staggering. Not only did Marcus have 2 children he didn't know existed, but one of them had inherited genetic traits that could affect his health decisions. Victoria's deception had potentially endangered Tyler by keeping crucial medical information from his biological father. Are you going to contact Marcus? I asked. I don't know, Dad replied honestly. Right now I'm focused on protecting Tyler and Madison's emotional stability. But at some point, Marcus has a right to know he has children, and Tyler has a right to know his complete medical history. Around 10 o'clock, Victoria called to say goodnight to the children. I listened from the kitchen as Dad supervised the conversations, making sure Victoria didn't make promises about coming home or try to undermine the explanation he'd given them about her absence. After the children were asleep, Dad made the call I'd been expecting. Victoria, we need to talk about next steps, he said when she answered. I've spoken with the children and they understand that you're staying with Jake temporarily, but we need to discuss long-term arrangements. I couldn't hear Victoria's side of the conversation, but Dad's responses painted a clear picture of someone who was trying to negotiate her way back into a situation where negotiation was no longer possible. The legal reality is that I have no parental rights to Tyler and Madison, Dad said firmly. You've spent 8 years letting me believe I was their father, while maintaining the ability to remove them from my life at any time. That level of deception isn't something I can forgive or forget. The conversation lasted another 30 minutes, with Victoria apparently alternating between apologies, justifications, and attempts to salvage their marriage. Dad's responses grew shorter and more definitive as the call progressed. "Victoria," he said finally, "I need you to understand that this marriage is over. The only question now is how we handle custody and visitation in a way that protects the children's well-being. You need to decide whether you want to work together on that or whether we need to involve lawyers immediately." When he hung up, Dad looked exhausted but resolute. For the first time since I'd known him, he'd drawn a line in the sand and refused to compromise on something that mattered to him. Victoria's betrayal had finally pushed him past his natural inclination to avoid conflict and find middle ground. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Strangely relieved," he admitted. "For months, I've felt like something was wrong but couldn't identify what it was. Now I know. The uncertainty was worse than the truth." As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized that tomorrow would be the first day in 8 years that our family would exist without Victoria's manipulation and deception. It would also be the first day that Dad and I could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty, rather than walking around the landmines of Victoria's secrets. 3 months later, I was sitting in Dad's kitchen, our kitchen now since I'd moved back home to help with Tyler and Madison, when the final divorce papers arrived by certified mail. Dad signed them without emotion, officially ending a marriage that had been built on lies from the beginning. The custody arrangement had been surprisingly smooth, partly because Victoria seemed to understand that fighting Dad legally would expose her deception to a level of scrutiny she couldn't afford. Tyler and Madison would stay with Dad as their primary guardian, with Victoria having regular visitation rights and shared decision-making on major issues. Marcus, Tyler, and Madison's biological father had been contacted through a lawyer and was slowly building a relationship with the children. He lived in Phoenix with his wife and their 2 children, but he'd flown out twice to meet Tyler and Madison in a neutral setting. The meetings were awkward but important. Tyler especially needed to understand his complete medical history and genetic background. The most unexpected development had been Dad's recovery. Away from the stress of Victoria's deception and with proper medical treatment, his heart condition had stabilized remarkably well. Dr. Martinez said that removing major life stressors sometimes had profound effects on cardiac health, and Dad was living proof of that connection. "Emma," Dad said as we cleaned up after dinner, Tyler and Madison playing in the living room, "I owe you an apology that's about 8 years overdue." I looked up from loading the dishwasher, surprised by his serious tone. "When Victoria first came into our lives, I was so grateful to feel happy again after your mother died that I stopped paying attention to how her presence affected you. I let her manage family dynamics because it was easier for me, but that meant I ignored how she was systematically excluding you from our family." The apology I'd waited years to hear was finally coming, but in a context I'd never imagined. "I see now that Victoria felt threatened by your relationship with me and your connection to your mother's memory. She worked to minimize your importance in our family because she was insecure about her own place in it. And I let that happen because avoiding conflict was more comfortable than protecting my daughter." Dad sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for me to join him. "But watching you step up to help with Tyler and Madison these past few months, seeing how much they love and trust you, has reminded me what family actually means. It's not about biology or legal documents or perfect harmony. It's about showing up for each other when everything falls apart." I felt tears beginning to form as years of hurt and confusion finally found resolution. "You've always belonged in this family, Emma. You belonged when you were the grieving 12-year-old who helped me survive losing your mother. You belonged when you were the college student coming home for holidays to a house that Victoria was redecorating to erase your mother's presence. And you belong now, as the adult who dropped everything to help me raise children who aren't biologically related to either of us." The irony was complete. Victoria had spent 8 years trying to prove that I didn't belong in this family, only to be removed herself when her own deception was revealed. Meanwhile, Tyler and Madison, who weren't biologically related to Dad or me, had become the center of a rebuilt family structure based on choice rather than genetics. "Tyler drew something for you yesterday," Dad said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings. "He asked me to give it to you when the right time came." The drawing showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a house: a tall man labeled Daddy, a woman with long hair labeled Emma, and 2 smaller figures labeled Tyler and Madison. At the top, in Tyler's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Our family." "He asked me if you were going to stay with us forever," Dad continued. "I told him that you'd stay as long as you wanted to, because this is your home too." From the living room came the sounds of Tyler and Madison arguing over television channels. Normal, everyday sibling disputes that represented the ordinary chaos of family life. These children, who'd been born from Victoria's deception, had become the foundation of our family's rebirth. "Dad," I said, wiping away tears that were equal parts grief and joy. "I'd like to stay. Not just to help with the kids, but because this feels like home for the first time in 8 years." He smiled. The first genuine, relaxed smile I'd seen from him since Victoria's lies were exposed. "Good. Because Tyler and Madison aren't the only ones who need you here. I need you too. It turns out that the daughter I've had all along is exactly the family member I need now." Outside, it was getting dark, and I could see lights coming on in houses throughout our neighborhood. Families were gathering for dinner, helping with homework, navigating the small dramas and joys that make up ordinary life. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I felt like I truly belonged to one of those families. Victoria had been wrong about everything, but she'd been most wrong about this. I had always been part of this family. I just needed the lies to be stripped away before everyone could see it clearly. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about families, truth, and the surprising ways that love survives even the most devastating betrayals.